Today's story sounds exactly like an urban legend. It sounds too exaggerated, too grotesque, too terrifying to be real, but it is. This is the true story of the Bitsevsky Park maniac. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help build the like button's new dresser they just got from IKEA. And as soon as you open it up, immediately find all the screws, strip them all, and then leave. Alright, let's get into today's story. The asshole of the world. Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Jayopia, which means the asshole of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families, calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely. And even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs today. There are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings, these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is Bitsevsky Park. The forest escape. Bitsevsky Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest. It is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it's right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 27 acres and stretches for miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitsevsky Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place, got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The Vanishing Man. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitsevsky Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia every now and again. People would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault they were in. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so, given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances, last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police. They would report their family members missing. But again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it. And locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them, and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2000 to too late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitsevsky Park. 24 of them would be men, 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men. But regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. Missing person, no? 41. But everything would change with missing person, though. 41 because, unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zyacharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back. And so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But, per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitsevsky Park when they noticed, well off the trail off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now this local was all alone, they had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was, and so they called the police and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual thing was Nikolai Zyacharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had one injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole in the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him. But there was nothing. And so, all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was, or whatever his attacker was, had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park. And it was looking like, probably, if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs. And with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park, looking for more bodies or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search, where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. The Bitsevsky Park maniac. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitsev Sky Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so, even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunk stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park, in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest, that caused men to disappear and attack Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitsev Sky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsev Sky Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But, unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning, almost certainly, this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. The chess master rule. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pikhushkin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay. But the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay. They determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so, the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so, his grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so, he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsev Sky Park where all these old men, who were total chess masters, were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so, he brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players, and very quickly Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. He was their star, he was their prodigy. They totally adored him and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so, for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsev Sky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park. including some of the men he played chess with the men he played chess with the men. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time. But every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine," and then he would leave anyways. Larissa called Gina. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before. And Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending. The pair walked outside at the same time and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Kolgina, and she was 48 years old and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building. And at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside, and so he suddenly feels bold and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now at this point, Bits of Sky Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Sky Park was like his happy place. And so, naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park, right outside of the forest. And the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising, given the fact that even amongst die-hard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. So, after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end. And so, they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now, they're stepping over broken logs and they're ducking under low-hanging branches. And it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they weren't no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa. And right away, he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted, or sad, or something. And then, as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her. And she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base. And she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark, and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked, and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so, Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying. And then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you gonna kill me?" Without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. The origin of a killer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow the tube in the head rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odichuk, and surprisingly Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later, and they headed off to Bitsev Sky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. And as they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed. But he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet, and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until, finally, Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumble to the ground either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. As soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well, kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it and then he picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he grabbed his hammer off the ground, and he left. The sewer system. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep, underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so, when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold. And then, after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, it would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so, whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But He died after being thrown in the well, and then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. The pattern of chess and death. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other. And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander. He's a good friend of his and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest. And at first, they're on a trail. But eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail. And they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried down. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig, and then he hands it to the man, who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he doesn't his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer. He walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then, just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well. He pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up and he dumps him into the well shaft. And then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims no. 16 and 17 who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively. After they had their head smashed with a hammer and they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft. And it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't. And after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pull themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander, but the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone, and if they didn't, the police would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it. And the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. The downfall. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold on to the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then, as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer. And then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole. And then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with. And she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him. And so he didn't really know what to do, but by the time they were rolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zyacharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well, and he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. The trial and sentence. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 60 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60-victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse and, in fact, seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. Alexander was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole. And the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So, virtually no human interaction, kept inside of a cell 24 hours a day, with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. So, that's gonna do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to help build the like button's new dresser they got from IKEA. And as soon as you open it up, take all the screws out, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast where we upload brand new, never before heard content on Monday mornings. We also upload remastered YouTube content on Thursdays. The podcast is just called MrBallen's Podcast, and it can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon, basically anywhere you get your podcasts. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is just MrBallen. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Español. We also have a Facebook page, a Snapchat channel, and very cool merch at Shop MrBallen. Come! If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya! I would imagine, after you hear the ending to today's story, that you will most likely go back and watch this all over again, because the ending completely changes the story. But Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. And we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. The filmmaker's passion. Ever since he was a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college and, in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television arts. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family. And so, it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what? What the heck? I will produce this movie. And so, he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bullock, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so, this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. The Kill Room. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter. And the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms which he called kill rooms. And inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood. And then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them, unbag up their body. And he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton. And so, Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching the Edmonton killer and his victims, and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case. And then, after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 40-page first draft of the script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him, "Under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie." And then, the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 40-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you the script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember, this story is based on actual events, and so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. The dating profile. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Gilles Tatreau was living alone in Edmonton. Gilles' life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Gilles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Gilles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Gilles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together. And I'm start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile. And he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him. But then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Gilles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Gilles, hey, you know, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Gilles is thrilled, and he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what, tell him. I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Gilles the strange, customized set of directions. It didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Gilles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open. And he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard. And then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house, and she would meet him there. Now Gilles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time he's thinking, you know, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Gilles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. The ambush. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right and he saw there was this car garage. And he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be. Although the door was not open all the way, it was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so, he turns off his truck and he gets out, and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door. But the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view. And so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go and then make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this car garage and he goes to the open side. He ducks down and he goes underneath, and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage. There was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his head. He whipped around and, even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him, holding a stun baton. Gilles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but The man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Gilles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. And immediately Gilles feels this coursing pain in his torso, and he falls to the ground. And then this man in the mask releases the trigger, and Gilles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garages. But as soon as Gilles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand. And he's aiming it right at Gilles. And so Gilles freezes. He has no idea what's going on. And this man who's got this mask on barks at Gilles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Gilles at this point is thinking, I'm gonna get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told, and he lies down on the plastic sheeting. And he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Gilles' eyes. And so as he's laying there, blind and terrified, Gilles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then, as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, who's going to find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Gilles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm gonna get killed in here. I know it. I'm gonna get killed. But if I'm gonna die on my terms. And so Gilles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not gonna do this. I'm not gonna go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Gilles to shoot him. And Gilles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Gilles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Gilles is suddenly so confident. He grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Gilles, and he just headbutts Gilles. Gilles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him, unslamming his skull into the ground. But Gilles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape, out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage. Gemini in between blows, he managed to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself, and he actually comes out of the jacket, and then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside, and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up, and then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage, and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline, and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's gonna be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway, and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face, and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up, he's so tired. But Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground who's calling out for help, and they run over to him and they get right in front of Giles. And Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, "He's trying to kill me." And the attacker, amazingly, just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off, and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, "Oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. That's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there, Raj." And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway, back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're gonna get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. So they say, "Hey, you're on your own, pal," and they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally he just took a deep breath, he pulled himself up, he stumbled down the alleyway, he got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him. But he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him. But he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what? I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. Johnny Altinger. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmond man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so, as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen who lived right in Edmond. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back. And before long, the two were humming it up. And then eventually, they actually agreed to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website. And so, instead, she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage. The door will be open. Go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen. And so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen, and it was no big deal. He'd happily follow her directions. And then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together. And then, before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends. And he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, "Hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going." And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early. And so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. So Johnny turns off his car, he gets out, and he starts walking over to this half-open garage door. And as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? You know, what's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside. And it's totally dark and he just says, hello. And there's a pause and then the lights come on. And Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything minus a table off to the side. And every surface is covered in plastic sheeting, the floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny. And finally, the man speaks and says, hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen. And actually, I just talked to Jen and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen. Yeah, she's running late. So I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes. So can you come back in 20 minutes? Come right back here. Come to the garage and I'll bring you up to the house. 'Cause I know you're meeting her up at the house. So, 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic-covered garage. But, you know, whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably, Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic-lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed. And he instinctively throws his hands up to protect his head and he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows as the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe bite. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, police, police, police. And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him with this pipe until, finally, Johnny collapses on the ground. But he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He ceased his initial barrage, and Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money. I'll give you anything. Just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, you promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go. But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so, with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade. And then, at some point, he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back, and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain and he curls over and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him. And then, finally, Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife and he stands up and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? Oh, I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's bodies. And then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up and then, a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. The script? At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. There's a reason for that. And it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making the script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were at. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Gen Z mail that had those strange directions. Well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. He explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document. And this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of the script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked, because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter. In real life, he needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them, so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so, after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny, and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience to enact it onto the end of the Giles attack kit. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark of murder, and he is currently serving life in prison. So, that's gonna do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly one or two video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shop MrBallen's. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same, it's just MrBallen. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is also MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, and a Facebook page just called MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called our MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.